Pandemic burnout. I mean, it's real. From teachers to grocery store workers, people have certainly felt the weight of a global pandemic at home and at work. And of course, being tired raises the likelihood of making errors. Now, it starts getting a little serious here when it happens to medical employees. Pharmacists across the entire country say they're burned out, and it's leading to dangerous mistakes with your prescriptions. I'm here joined by our investigative reporter, Candice, who's been looking into what's going on at drugstores here in California and in the Bay Area. Candice, what did you uncover during this investigation?
So, Abby, there's been a nationwide conversation of pharmacists and technicians being burned out. So we really wanted to find out what's happening here in California. And not surprisingly, we found out it is a problem here. You know, I spoke to nearly a dozen pharmacists and technicians who say they're not just, they're burned out, but also profit-driven prescription quotas, especially at chain stores, they say is adding to that pressure. And it's a lot of problems that have been around for years that they say during the pandemic, it just hit a breaking point. But the big thing that we want to focus on here is, everyone's stressed out. But this isn't like you getting your order wrong at the restaurant or like at a fast food joint. These are people's prescriptions where the consequences can be very serious.
How big of a burnout problem is the pharmacy industry facing right now?
Yeah, nationwide, right? So this conversation is nothing new. It's been going on for months. Nationwide pharmacists and pharmacy technicians afraid to come forward, but it was so bad they've been coming forward and talking to news outlets. But what's different here is I wanted to find out what's happening here in California.
Yeah.
What's happening here in the Bay Area. And the problem was so big that state regulators here in the Bay Area approved a survey of 4,000 California pharmacists to really find out what's happening. How serious is it? And what's interesting about this, I even asked the state regulators, why don't you just look at the data of all the medication errors you're getting? Well, we learned that pharmacies are not required in general to report medication mistakes to regulators. So that's why they had to do this survey.
Why are they not required?
Well, then we asked for an interview from the state, from regulators. They did not agree to an interview, but we have heard from pharmacists saying that there is a culture of not wanting to be punitive, that if there's so many mistakes coming out of one pharmacy, it's because they're overwhelmed. And so the solution would be to help them come back into compliance. Now there's mixed reactions to that, but we do know that it's creating this sort of data blind spot where they had to do this survey to figure out what's really going on. The first thing that stuck out from this survey was it appears these problems are a lot worse with chain pharmacies. And as I mentioned, it's because pharmacists and pharmacy technicians say these chain pharmacies, Walgreens, CVS, and Rite Aid, they're enforcing these profit-driven quotas on their workers, unlike independent pharmacies. Now, these chains, to be fair, they say, these are not individual based. We have to see how our stores are doing.
Yeah.
We need to see how we're doing in order for us to staff properly. So that's how they're responding to that. But as for their survey, for instance, 91% of chain pharmacists reported not having enough staffing to ensure proper patient care. 91%. 91%.
Wow.
And
that is way higher than I would have thought.
Oh, so most of them said that we don't have enough staff to make sure you and I are safe when we go get our prescriptions. And that's compared to 37% of pharmacists at independents. Another thing that stuck out to me was 11% of chain pharmacists said medication errors are not documented properly, compared to just 4% at independent pharmacies. Now, we hope that percentage is zero, but we saw that discrepancy. So yeah, serious problems, and appears to be more serious at chain stores.
Well, we're talking here, Candice, about people getting the wrong medication, as you were just talking about earlier. How serious can medication errors be?
I mean, it can vary, right? Some are not a big deal, but it can be a big deal.
Yeah.
Out of the 500 complaints that state regulators received about medication errors during the pandemic, they said that some of them included serious harm to patients and even death. As I mentioned, it's not a wrong food order, right? This is someone's prescription. So if you get the wrong medication, if you get the wrong dosage, or maybe you just get it late and you really needed that medication, depending on the patient, depending on the medication, someone's life could be on the line. So, I gave you that 500 figure of more than 500 complaints indicating patient harm, but that number, the real number, is expected to be a lot higher, again, because pharmacies aren't required to report mistakes.
They're not filing.
So that was still a very surprising thing we learned during our investigation.
Wow, that is very surprising. Now, how big of a prescription backlog can pharmacies have?
We spoke to pharmacists and we heard from pharmacists who reported hundreds of prescriptions not yet verified at a pharmacy. So that's concerning enough. That means you won't get your prescription on time, or if they have too much work, then it's more likely they'll make a mistake. But we saw one image of a chain pharmacy's monitor that showed more than 2 1,000 prescriptions backlogged in that
Wow.
single store. We showed the company that. We asked, hey, what happened here? That company had no comment, but to reiterate, other pharmacists who saw that said that was a very dangerous situation, because with that much of a backlog, people are working faster and the chances of mistakes goes up.
So in your report, you talk about a law that was just implemented to address these concerns. What's the solution here? What's this law consist of?
So this law was passed and was implemented in January, SB 362, and it prohibits companies from establishing these potentially dangerous quotas onto workers, saying, hey, you have to do a certain number of prescriptions a certain amount of time. So they are now prohibited from communicating that, but there's a lot of gray area right? We're hearing from industry workers of, hey, is this really going to work? We're hearing that the success of this law will be dependent on companies implementing the laws themselves. And regulators won't really know if there's any violations of this law unless workers report violations. And some workers are nervous to report, but hey, if there's only 2 pharmacists there and you report, there's only 2 of you there. So there are some concerns, but a lot of people are saying it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, that's good news. I want to ask you though, Candice, I mean, what made you want to investigate this issue? What was it? Was it a personal situation? Did you just see this kind of on the rise?
Well, there's been this nationwide conversation, but really I've been investigating healthcare during the pandemic for years, specifically hospitals, nurses burnout, and people sometimes forget that pharmacies are an extension, are part of that healthcare system.
Yeah.
So when these reports were coming out of a pharmacist being burned out and making mistakes with medication, I had the same questions that you guys might have. What's happening here? What's happening in California? What's happening at my drugstore? And I think what we found was the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Okay, well, you can watch the full report right now on NBCBayArea.com/investigations or on our NBC Bay Area streaming app available on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire. Thank you so much, Candice.
Thanks, Abby.